All right, I think we are going to get started. I'm sure that there are folks that are going to be coming in and as we go, but this will be recorded so folks can catch whatever they missed in the beginning. So welcome everyone. My name is Asher Miller and I'm the Executive Director of Post Carbon Institute, the host of today's conversation. Thank you all for joining us, and I want to thank Sarah Peters, Nick Tilsen, and Tim DeChristopher in particular for taking the time to share their answers to what I view as sort of the critical question of our time, and that is, in the face of climate change and the other crises that we face, what do I do? So we've reached out to Nick and Sarah and Tim, both because we find their stories inspirational and informative, and because they've taken bold steps in one of three primary spheres of action beyond, building the personal resilience I think that all of us need to begin with, that we at Post Carbon Institute believe are absolutely critical to respond to these challenges. One is opposing the locking in of future greenhouse gas emissions. Another is engaging politically. And the third is building community resilience. So we have just under 90 minutes or so together to cover a lot of ground. Therefore, in the interest of time, I'm just going to do some very brief introductions. To begin, Tim DeChristopher opposed fossil fuel extraction on public lands and paid the price with his freedom. He now helps lead the Climate Disobedience Center. Sarah Peters is an environmental engineer who recently ran and won a seat in the Nevada State Assembly on a climate change platform. And Nick Tilsen leads the NDN Collective to help rebuild the strength, resilience, and sustainability of the diverse tribal nations in the United States, building upon a decade of work in his native Oglala Lakota Nation. Also, in the interest of time, we're going to dispense with the discussion about just how dire the situation is with regard to climate change and our other socio-political and environmental issues. If you're here, I'm going to assume that I think it's safe to assume that you don't need to be convinced that we face some existential threats. So what we're going to do instead is to ask each of our panelists to share a bit about their personal stories, what led them to take the actions that they have, and why they would encourage all of us to consider taking similar steps, and what concrete suggestions or resources they can recommend. We'll then have a bit of a four-way discussion before opening up the floor to answer your questions. At any point during the webinar, please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box by clicking on the Q&A link at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We'll do our best to get to as many of these questions, but we are going to ask your forgiveness in advance because we won't likely be able to get to everyone's. This is being recorded, and we will be sharing the link with you in the next day or so. Okay, so now with all that introduction out of the way, I'd like to start with you, Sarah. Sarah, you recently ran for public office and won a seat in the Nevada State Assembly. Can you share a little bit about why you decided to run for office? I mean, a lot of people talk about getting out the vote as the way you do politically. You took it obviously a step further. So maybe you could talk a little bit about why you chose to run, and also maybe share your views about why government, specifically, I would say local and state government, are so key in addressing the climate crisis.
Yeah. Thank you, and thanks for hosting this webinar. This is great. So I started my career in 2011 when Nevada was in the worst space for jobs. And as an environmental engineer, I thought I would either work in water engineering or end up working in mining in Nevada. And where I ended up was working in policy. I started working with natural resource development projects, doing permitting compliance, and started to really learn the regulations. I spent the first 2 weeks of my career reading regulations, Nevada statutes, and getting to know like what is the framework of how we develop our natural resources in the state of Nevada. From there, I started working with a company, an environmental engineering company that works primarily with tribal governments. And started to see this landscape of federal and state and tribal and local governments, and how they all interplay together on these issues of how do we work with our natural resources, and how do we share our natural resources. In that work, I also got to see how damaged the system is, and how it doesn't work all the time. And I'm a problem solver, right? I don't really see problems without solutions, but when you work in regulation, you start to see these patterns where the solutions are not laid out well, where the solutions can cause more damage than benefit, right? You start to see that they're broken. And in that vision, seeing that the system was broken, I started to think about what it would take to change the system. And I grew up, my dad would tell me that the best way to change the system is from the inside, right? You can break it from the outside, but if you don't change the foundation, the fundamentals of it, then what really is changing? And I think it's twofold. And I think we'll hear a little bit about that from Tim as well. So I started thinking about what it would take to change this, the state of our natural resource management in Nevada. And I figured that the state legislature was a good place to start. Our regulations aren't really great or protective. We default to federal regulations, and under the current administration, those are being dismantled. So to protect Nevada, we have to have someone in office who understands what we're dealing with on the ground and can make those effective changes to our regulatory statutes. And as I was thinking about what that would look like, I started putting together this kind of profile of the person who would be the best person to take that on, right? Someone who worked in policy and on the ground, who's really impassioned about environmental issues. And I started to see my own resume. So I decided that if I was going to complain about it, and try to see a solution, that I should try to be that solution as well. So I decided to run, and I ran a very different race than most people do. I ran a very authentic race. I didn't ever tell anybody they should vote for me. I asked them if I could earn their vote. I did a lot of video. I did a lot of talking. I walked the streets in my neighborhood over and over and over again, talking to people and talking to them about my passionate issue of climate change and environmental support. And I won by a huge number. I won almost 47% of my district in a 4-way primary. So all of us were Democrats, right? All of us had the same background. All of us had the same issue bases, but I think that the narrative of environmental challenges is something that people are hungry to hear about, right? They want to see solutions. So that's where I started. I also have 3 kids, and when I decided to run for office, I knew that I needed to stick to it so that I could show them what it looks like to be a part of a system that feels a little unattainable sometimes. And that kept me going, right? My kids deserve something better. And I was going to work hard to show them that it's possible to do that, to get to a place where you can make big changes.
Did you, you said that when you were thinking about the kind of candidate that you would want, you talked about somebody who actually understood the sort of regulatory environment, understood policy. How much of a difference do you feel like that made, that you had some of that background? I mean, for folks who are participating in this, who might actually consider, the audacious act of running for office, I mean, what would you say to them in terms of the work that they would need to do kind of to lay the ground for them to be effective, not just at running, but at actually being a representative in government?
One of the questions that I got a lot was, well, what can you actually do? What can we do at the state? Isn't EPA supposed to save us, right? And my response is, because I know the regulations, we can do a lot. We have a lot of space in Nevada to be able to manage our own resources in a really effective way, and to require that our resources be protected, and that includes human resources as well, right? That we bring into the conversation socioeconomic disparities as much as we bring into the conversation water pollution, and that they can go hand in hand, and we have to build them in places in the statute that maybe you wouldn't normally think about building them. But I could see that, Pat, like where in the statute we could put those things and what the language would look like and what would be the most protective, which is part of why I thought it would be good for somebody to run for office who had experience within that framework.
Mm-hmm. And if somebody doesn't come from that background, I mean, would you suggest to them that they get involved in, local governments in other ways to sort of understand how that operates?
That's a good question. My background in engineering, right? I never thought I would work in regulation. It's kind of where I just landed. Yeah. But I would suggest taking a look at what's included in your state statutes, what your state already does, what kind of offices that your state has to address environmental issues, what they're doing right now. I just found out yesterday that the city of Reno, which is where my district is, has one of the best climate change adaptation plans on the West Coast. It's amazing what they're trying to do. So getting to know what your state is doing already can help you build a framework for how to address these issues in an effective manner, and who the players are, the stakeholders are, who you need to get on board to make those changes. I don't think it's hard. These conversations, when you can put them into a context where people have buy-in, where they can absorb that social cost that we're talking about, right? The social cost of the loss of natural resources, of the impacts to our environment. When you can talk to people about what they can do to defer that impact, right? Or eliminate that impact, people are typically on board. One of the hardest things I think about talking about environmental issues is it feels so unattainable. It's such a big thing. The world is a huge thing, right? How do we as the state of Nevada make enough difference to impact climate change that's global? Mm-hmm. But breaking it down into those small spaces of like shutting down our coal-fired power plants. Well, if we do that, we have an opportunity to rebuild our infrastructure, our energy infrastructure, so that it adapts to our vulnerabilities. And I think that those are really intriguing conversations that most people are really hungry for.
Yeah, and I think that you're talking about the things that people could do to help mitigate. There's also all this stuff around adaptation, which is very much localized, which I think is a good lead-in to bring Nick into the conversation. Nick, I wanted to ask you a bit about to share your story of working to engage in community resilience building at the Pine Ridge Reservation. So what drew you to do that, as an individual? And maybe you could talk a little bit about what has been achieved so far in the vision for the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation, which I know you helped create and led for 10 years.
Yeah, Habanakiapi, Nick Tilsen, Amachiapi, Chantea Washtenap, Chuzapalo, get you in my Lakota language this afternoon. And I'm Oglala Lakota from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And really our work, we didn't come into our work really thinking about climate change as our lens. We grew up here in the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and we're a group of young people. Most of us, when we started the organization, we're having kids for our first time in our early 20s. And we were part of a movement of reconnecting a lot of young people to spirituality and culture, and it created like an increased sense of commitment to place. And Pine Ridge is one of these places that's one of the poorest, it's ground zero for inequity in America. It's one of the poorest places in the country, with some of the low, the highest rates of poverty. This is deep entrenched 200 years old of poverty that exists here. And we wanted something better for our children. And we recognized that the current economic system that was in place wasn't aligned with Indigenous values. And we as a people are also being excluded from the process. The current economic system was creating extreme pockets of poverty and extreme pockets of poverty in indigenous communities. And so when we started doing this work, we started really grappling with, we got to create opportunities right here in the ground that makes sense for our community and our people, that it's aligned with our values. And so if we were going to start to do work, we couldn't repeat the same model. We had to think about the fact of how could we build housing that was aligned with our cultural values. In Lakota, we have a saying in Lakota that says "Madako Yase," which means that we're all related. And we have this belief, it's a 7-generation concept belief. And the idea is to look back 3 generations, to look forward 3 generations, and to honor the generation that you're in. Which, if you think about it, it's a very indigenous way. It's an indigenous interpretation of also sustainable development goals, by meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And so we embarked on this community planning and engagement endeavor. We didn't know anything about development at all. We were culture bearers, community activists, young parents, and we started engaging our community about shaping a vision for what we wanted for our future. And we came and arrived at this idea of building a community from scratch. How do we build a 21st century climate resilient community that's aligned with our values? And so as we started doing these community meetings and gathering knowledge about the kind of jobs people wanted in the community, the housing that people needed, our access to healthy food, and looking at all aspects of food, water, shelter, safety, and education, we had to look at what was the future impacts of climate change. And so we brought up data from the National Drought Mitigation Center and looked at the data for our region, which said that it was going to have an increase of rainfall per year, but falling in denser periods of time, followed by long periods of time with no rain, which all of that interprets as a desertification of land. And so we were immediately thinking, okay, how do we build a new development that creates housing, jobs, opportunity, meets basic needs of our people, gets the water away from the buildings, but then slows it down to try to keep it close and trying to increase the biodiversity of the community that we're doing. And so, what started off as a group of ragtag guys and, young men and women from Pine Ridge, all of a sudden we became developers. And we took this idea from just a vision to implementation, and basically planned 34 acres in the heart of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation that has now an organization that has grown to employ over 120 people. We've built 21 units of single-family housing, 12 units of apartment complex, a community center, a small farm, and begin to build with communities of tomorrow. And our theme has always been, hey, if we can do this on a bunch of ragtag guys from Pine Ridge can do this, what's everybody else's excuse? If we can do this on Pine Ridge, in the poorest, most isolated place in America, really this type or some type of this work is attainable for all people. And so that's been a big part of our journey, what Thunder Valley has been about. In that process, we started being reached out to as our story got lifted up over time. We started getting contacted by other tribal communities. In fact, we got contacted by over 27 different Native nonprofits and 43 different tribes coming from about 70 different indigenous communities who were wanting to do something similar. And similar to what we're doing at Thunder Valley. And so that's when we kind of went to the drawing table and really looked at the pure lack of investment that currently exists to Native people, and decided to build a system, a new organization, which is now called the Indian Collective, that is focused on increasing philanthropic investments, social impact investment, capacity to build more communities like this in different places, and really be a part of the growing infrastructure needed for the indigenous people's movement.
Mm-hmm. You said that, I mean, part of what the thinking was that if you could do it at Pine Ridge, what's everyone else's excuse? And you talked a little bit about how um, you've been reached out to by, other tribal nations. Are there, what are your thoughts about the application, I guess, of what you guys have been doing and what you've learned becoming developers and thinking about the needs of your community? Uh, do you see that that's applicable to communities all over the United States, or do you feel like it's hard to translate that? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's complete. I mean, I think it's completely transferable. Meaning, like what I always tell people is, don't actually do what we did in Pine Ridge. Do what is unique to your place, to the
Mhm.
culture of your place, to the culture of your community, of your assets, and the spirit of your place, and quite frankly, the climate of your place. And so, but engage your people, organize, do ground up organizing. Don't do trickle down from the top stuff, because then you're going to wonder why the community is not engaged with what you're doing. And so that our fundamental model is like, really thinking about organizing and building collective power of people, because then you actually have people really engaged in becoming the architects of their own future.
And it sounds like, I mean, you talked about starting with the community and listening, in a sense, to understanding what the community's needs are. But you also talked about understanding. You talked about looking at climate models, right? So it's a bit of this combination of recognizing and really listening to what people are saying are their immediate needs, but then also looking at, and maybe it's the seven generations thing that you were talking about. So sort of looking ahead as well, and actually looking at scientific data and bringing that into the equation. But it also sounds like you're talking about, I mean, you've created jobs there, right? So
Yeah.
providing economic benefit and employment. Is it wrong to assume that that was a big part of the ingredient of making this successful?
No, I mean, we had no choice. There was 80% unemployment in our community. So, I mean, we are one of those things where, like, whether our community even understood what climate change even meant, what we understood is the climate of our existing community is a byproduct of an unsustainable system that has never worked for our community or for our people. And
Mhm.
so we came from this place of, there is an element to sort of pulling up your bootstraps and making this happen, because places like in extreme pockets of poverty and places like Pine Ridge have existed because they have been, forgotten about. And in the current system, a lot of times there has to be byproducts of the system that don't work. And so I think a lot of our, coming into looking at climate data and stuff was really based in traditional knowledge of, our ancestors, telling us we need to look, back a few generations, forward a few generations onto the generation that we're in, which then inherently means that we have to be thinking sustainably. We have to be thinking about the changing climate. We also have to think about, how do our people get food, water, shelter, education, and safety today.
Mhm. Well said. Thanks. I want to bring Tim in here. And Tim, you became, I think, well known, certainly in certain circles, for the brave stand you took against the selling of leases to oil companies on federal lands. You became known as Bitter 70. You bid against these and then were tried and imprisoned for doing so. I mean, sort of the ultimate price for that action. Can you just talk a little bit about what compelled you to do that, and then maybe make a case for climate disobedience? What does it mean to take part in climate disobedience, and why is that an important part of the strategy to respond to this crisis?
Sure.
Especially after you paid that price, if you're still on board with that strategy.
Okay. Um, yeah. So I got into this around 2007 and 2008 when I was focusing more and more on the climate crisis, and when it was more and more obvious that the strategies that the climate movement was using at that time were not working. We were coming off a couple of decades at that point of a strategy focused on appeasing those at the top of our power structure. And there was this narrative of how we could have a cleaner, greener version of the world that we have now that swaps out energy sources, but pretty much keeps everything else the same. And that certainly wasn't inspiring to the broad swath of people who don't profit from the status quo and who are marginalized by those power structures. But it also wasn't getting the job done in terms of actually creating the kind of change that we needed, because there was no pressure on those folks at the top of that power structure to actually change. So I was seeing that strategy was really out of alignment with most of the successful social movements in our history, that it generally articulated a big and radical vision, and then really challenged that power structure and really threatened their control in major ways, particularly with confrontational strategies like civil disobedience. So I saw the need for more of that. And going into it at that point, I was very focused on mitigation, on getting folks to wake up and pay attention and mobilize to stop the fossil fuel expansion that was happening at that time, and to get us onto a different trajectory. And so when the Bureau of Land Management oil and gas auction came around at the end of the Bush administration in Utah, it really just seemed like the perfect opportunity to take that kind of action, because it was such a blatant example of the drill now, think later mentality that was driving the climate crisis. And so I showed up there and looked for what I could do to make a difference, and the opportunity to outbid the oil companies just sort of presented itself to me. And then it was a pretty simple choice for me, really, knowing that it would suck to go to prison, but I could live with that. But that, looking at what we were on track for, knowing that I had an opportunity to do something about it in 2008, if I didn't take it, and then, decades later, I was facing young people who were born into a broken world, I couldn't live with that. And so I felt compelled to act. And it did have a big impact in terms of waking up a circle of people that were connected to me in one way or another, whether that was geographically there in Utah, or demographically, folks that could associate me with their kids. There were a lot of folks that were women around my mother's age that got really engaged and connected to what I had done. And I think all of us have that kind of circle of folks that would really be woken up if they saw us in harm's way. And so I think that's one of the most powerful things about civil disobedience, is that we're putting ourselves in a vulnerable position, and then that vulnerability arouses the empathy of people around us. And I strongly believe that empathy is one of the most important parts of our human nature. And one of the few things that is strong enough to really rattle us out of our everyday experience, where we've got lots of things to worry about, serious needs that need to be taken care of, and also lots of things to distract us and to keep us complacent and staring at screens. And so I think empathy is a powerful force that can get us out of that. And that action also kind of came at a time when there were a lot of other folks that were looking for more aggressive strategies to fight the fossil fuel industry. And so there was this wave of increased civil disobedience then over the years after that. But also over the years after that, it became increasingly clear that we weren't going to stop climate change. We saw the failure of climate legislation in the US when Democrats controlled every branch of government. We saw the failure of Copenhagen. And so, so my focus with this shifted from being primarily about mitigation to also thinking about what do we need to get us on a path where we can navigate these inevitable hardships and disruptions that are coming our way in a way that maintains our humanity. And I still felt like civil disobedience is a really important strategy for that, because it's modeling a different kind of power in the world. So much of our culture is built on the power of domination, whether that's patriarchy or white supremacy or capitalism. It's rooted in this notion that the way to have strength, or the way to have power, the way to influence the world around us, is through dominating others and controlling others. And I think at the root of civil disobedience is the notion that we can have power through our vulnerability. We can expose ourselves with our own vulnerability and connect with people in a really powerful way that is not based on manipulating them or dominating them or scaring them into compliance, but is based on tapping into the best part of their humanity with their empathy, and really forming authentic connections through our stories and through our shared vulnerability. And that then through that connection lies a lot of power. So I think that's a critical thing to be modeling in the world right now, as we get closer and closer to the really significant impacts of this crisis. And as that sense of insecurity, I think, is being felt more and more in the world, and people are responding to it in increasingly desperate ways by scapegoating certain classes of people. I think it's more important now than ever that we're able to step up and embrace a kind of power in the world that is not based on turning against one another with fear and hatred, but is really rooted in turning towards one another with mutuality and love and vulnerability. And so, for the last part of your question about whether I'd still do it, absolutely. And my motivations and understanding of what I'm doing in this work have certainly shifted. But I still feel like this is a really critical piece of the puzzle of all the different kinds of action that we need at this point.
And you said that you didn't necessarily set out to do what you did, right? You set out to go, but you didn't necessarily set out to bid. And I'm wondering if you had a clear sense at that point of what the consequence might be. So for folks who are listening now who might consider, you're putting out a challenge for people to make themselves vulnerable, right? And that is, in a sense, put themselves in harm's way or to take a risk. So are there lessons or advice that you would provide people in advance of doing something like that to consider that you didn't have the benefit of when you took the action that you did?
Yeah, I had a small community of folks that I was connected to at that time that had committed to supporting each other in doing this kind of stuff, and together we had been, we'd been sort of going through the process of grappling with the reality of climate change at where we were at that point, and going through that existential crisis together, and talking a lot of strategy together, and so in that way I'd been sort of building up the general preparation for doing this kind of action and taking that level of risk. A seminal point in that process for our community was a speech that Naomi Klein gave at Pioneers in 2008, at the point when it was clear that Obama was going to win the presidency, and she looked at where he was at on climate promises at that point, climate policy promises, And she pointed out that it's clearly not even close to good enough for what we need to respond to the climate crisis. But she made it clear that Obama is a centrist, and that's where his power has always come from. He's good at finding the center and going there, and that's never going to change. And so she said, if the center is not good enough to prevent the collapse of civilization, then our job is to move the center. And so we had a lot of conversations in our community about what that means to move the center. And one of the things that came out of that for me is that you can't move the center from the center. Just like you can't tilt the scales from the fulcrum. You have to go to the edge and push. And so I'd been doing a lot of that general kind of preparation of like weighing those consequences and preparing for it, and had a small community of support. But I hadn't done a lot of specific training around this action, around sort of the way civil disobedience is normally approached in the climate movement. And there's a lot of that out there, and I think it's useful. Over the past 10 years, I've been involved in a lot of those trainings, trained a lot of other people. I think that kind of preparation for mass action is critical. But I think it can't be used to limit our thinking. I think we do have to be willing to step outside of what has been done, even step outside of what has been done within the direct action side of the climate movement, because this is really unprecedented territory, and nobody has ever solved the climate crisis before. We've done a lot of the things that we can think of to do, and found some things that work a little bit, a lot of things that don't work at all, and nothing that works as much as we need. And so we need people bringing their own creativity and their own experimentation, and just like in any other realm, that has to mean a willingness to fail sometimes, or a willingness to deal with tough consequences. And the stakes are certainly high when it comes to, engaging in civil disobedience actions and dealing with the criminal justice system in this country. But again, that's a kind of preparation for the world that we're headed for, which is going to be an extremely dangerous and risky world, where we're not going to have a choice about vulnerability. And so I think some practice with it is good experience for us right now.
It's well said. Well, I want to open it up, Nick and Sarah, for you to jump in as well. We did sort of frame this as, talking about sort of three different avenues that people could try to engage in answering the question of what do I do in the face of the climate crisis and these other challenges that we face. I mean, the first thing I would say about that is these are not opposed strategies at all. They're complementary, right? And I also think that these are three among many different, flavors or variations, and it really depends on each person's circumstances. Also seems like there's a common thread here for the three of you, and that is that you had to pave your own way in a sense, right? And to take some risks. So I'd like to just hear from you whatever reflection you have on sort of the personal journey aspect of it and what it means to take risk, and what advice you might give to someone who's here wrestling with how to answer that question for themselves, irrespective of what strategy they decide to take on. So any thoughts to that question?
I could add on something to that a little bit. I think part of it would be is don't get stuck in a box. I mean, the assumption that because you're working on climate mitigation over here, that you can engage in direct action over here isn't right. In fact, I think it's like like really powerful when you connect the issues together. You know, for example, when we were building the development at Thunder Valley, and we were actually, our water for the development we were building at Thunder Valley was actually coming from the Missouri River. And so on the very same day that we connected to the rural water line, bringing water from the Missouri River into this development we were building at Thunder Valley, I was actually locked down to a piece of machinery in Standing Rock, and stopped construction for 2 days, or actually 3 days of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And part of that was to make also the statement that, like, this idea that like resistance is everywhere and in many different forms, and the more that we can do to connect these issues, because we are all taking risks in different forms depending on what we're doing, but the more that we can connect the issues and see each other as human beings together in this work and not be siloed, that will be my biggest message to the listeners and to the people watching, is that don't get stuck in like, this is one strategy and you have to stay within this box or this strategy, because I think that there's concern in that sometimes, where we have to be able to have the rawness to connect with one another. But the fact that we're not gonna defeat and change the trajectory of climate change unless human beings actually do take risk, because you can't just sit on the couch and hope that it's going to change.
I really appreciate that, Nick, because I was feeling the same way, that we have to have people in all spaces to be able to have these conversations, so we can have cohesive language around where we're moving things. So what I found when I came to the legislature to ask them to change the things I saw that needed to be changed, they didn't have the language to have that conversation with me, because they didn't work in the field. They didn't know what the background and the history was. And so I had to find a way to build that into this space. And Tim, I think that you did the same thing with bringing your vulnerability to the surface and really showcasing vulnerabilities as being a place of power. And people can identify with vulnerabilities. We all see them in ourselves, right? And that's one of the things that keeps us hung up. But it's also one of the things that keeps us creative and motivated and empowered, especially when we have people around us who can also show up in vulnerability and who can also support us in our own vulnerabilities. One of the things I wanted to comment on, actually, from Tim's comments, was moving to move the center, right? And it depends on what kind of center you're trying to move. You have to have a mobile center. You have to have you can push an object, but if it's a mountain and immovable, it's not gonna do anything. So again, having someone in different spaces, right, who can help move down the line, from the center, from the outside, from the middle. I think we have to keep having conversations, as difficult as they are, and keep allowing each other to be empowered in the space that feels the most empowered. And I think that I'm actually really impressed with this panel. I think this is really beautiful landscape of how much work is already being done in these, maybe what feels like silos, but is becoming a chain and a cohesive movement.
Yeah.
I agree completely. I mean, I think those connections are critical in those conversations outside of our silos, or our potential for silos. And I think that's how we avoid getting stuck in that box that Nick was talking about. And like in my own case, once I'd done that civil disobedience, when we formed an organization called Peaceful Uprising, it attracted all this attention, and a lot of people came and got involved. But then, it was clear that one of the biggest things going on then in early 2009 was this fight over legislation, and so we ended up mobilizing a lot of those people to get involved in that process, and putting a lot of pressure on our Blue Dog congressperson that we had at the time in Utah. Enough pressure that he actually went into hiding, and so that revealed to us that we had to get rid of him. And so we ended up launching a congressional campaign, and we kind of did it like in our own outside kind of way, where none of the established politicians in Utah would run against him because he came from a political dynasty family. And so we ended up putting out a Craigslist help wanted ad for courageous congressperson. And it kind of like went viral and got all this attention. And that congressperson had sold out all the other progressives in Utah as well. So we formed this big coalition then that held public interviews for the people who had applied for that job. And we ended up with a retired high school civics teacher that became the candidate. And she actually split the delegate vote at the convention, and forced a runoff primary. And so, like, as an organization that was explicitly a civil disobedience kind of organization, we ended up being at the center of a congressional campaign at the same time, and it felt natural. Like, it felt like it was part of our work, and it kept feeding. It kept feeding all of us who were involved, and kept building our power and our connections.
Thanks. A couple of questions come to my mind, but I want to just remind folks that you have an opportunity to ask our esteemed panel questions that come to your mind. It could be, hopefully on topic. They could be personal, philosophical. They could be very tactical. Just use the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Before we jump to those questions, I am curious to hear from you guys about balance, personal balance. I think you guys have talked about operating in sort of multiple areas, and Nick, you talked about on the one hand you're building community, on the other hand you're opposing the Dakota pipeline. Tim, you talked about accidentally running a political campaign, but if we recognize that it's sort of an all of the above strategy, I'm just curious about your thoughts about how you find personal balance. And do you feel like for yourselves it's better to try to focus in one particular area? Is it better to make sure that you're exposing yourselves to working in different arenas, even in order to kind of learn or recharge your batteries? What's your personal take, each of you, on that question?
I can jump in there. There's a lot of things that I do for balance. Right now it's spring here, and so gardening is a huge part of my life and growing stuff. But there's some of the folks that I work with that started an organization called Conceivable Future, which is primarily women talking about how climate change is impacting their decision of whether or not to have children. They came up with a really amazing model about this kind of balance for activists. And I'm going to see if I can share my screen here to actually show they did this beautiful artwork. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this.
If you can, we can also share it in a link when we send out an email with a recording to folks. If you send that to me, Tim, we can get it out to folks afterwards.
I think that's a really interesting point, Tim. I remember when I started my career in environmental.
Am I sharing?
Yeah, we can see it. Yep.
Okay. Awesome.
I had a friend who told me she had one child, and she told me it was irresponsible to have more than one. And when I got pregnant with my second, I really had to come to terms with what that meant to me as a person who cared about the future of this planet, and what I was going to do, taking on these small people who would be left with a legacy that I wasn't even happy about in my mid-20s. And then I had a third one. What I try and do, and I'm not sure that this is balance at all, but I live this narrative every day, right? What can I do? What little steps can I do? What can I talk to my kids about that will impress upon them the importance of responsibility for our planet, for self-responsibility, to have difficult conversations with people about these bigger issues. But I also, and this maybe is where my balance is I allow myself to forgive myself for the days I just can't, or the days that I just can't. When I have to get a coffee and a paper cup, right? Because I need the coffee, and being okay with having those slip ups, but still sustaining that my most authentic self is the person who lives this narrative every day.
Yeah.
And
very well said.
In addition to that, I try to network with people, right? As much as I have these conversations with my kids, I try and have those conversations with everybody, right? This is the reason I'm making this decision, and why I feel like this is a decision that is in line with the authentic message of what I live. And then hopefully kind of giving a little bit of that weight onto to the next person, who can then share that with people around them, and spreading that responsibility and social narrative weight across a broader spectrum of people.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to pull that up again, Tim? Can you do that quickly?
Let's see if I can
Sure.
do. Wait, where'd it go?
I'll give you a few seconds, and then we'll just
Okay.
visit with the folks later.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, so this was just broken down into a graphic to be able to visualize kind of what a balance looks like for an activist, of having the big yes of stuff that we know that we need to build in our community and in our world, the big no of stuff that we know we need to stop, a quadrant on building the community resilience, focusing locally, and then a quadrant that's sort of focused on the self. One part of which is sort of like the responsible self of like, what's my carbon footprint, and like how am I growing and learning more, and also just like what just makes me feel good. What do we do just because it's fulfilling and nourishing and brings us joy, and so you know, that's just one way to think about that. You know, and obviously it's not like a particularly quantifiable kind of thing, you know, to measure all those as percentages or whatever. But it's just a way to think about what might be missing in the work that we're doing. You know, like, are we all in one area? Are we out of balance in one way or another?
I like that a lot.
I think my I don't know. I mean, I think that this issue of balance, you know, being balanced in an unbalanced time. I mean, to be honest, like, if I'm supposed to be balanced in this work, I'm not at all, and I'm just being totally freaking honest. And because we are at we're in a place of total crisis on this planet, and I get how we can be balanced people as we go through this world, this very, very unbalanced society and world that we live in today. But I mean, my worry is when people start talking about balance, it starts to be interpreted as a lack of urgency. And I don't, so that's just sometimes like I get that feeling. It gives me anxiety, you know, when I think about like, we need urgency. We need people to be getting up worried about this in the morning and worried about it going at night, because it's affecting people's lives everywhere around the whole world. And so, you know, you know, for me, it's nature, you know, being in nature, like so much of about what this whole battle is about what is happening in nature. Go out, go there, like there, go out into nature. And that's, for me, that's where I find the things that are replenishing me that I'm looking for. Because for whatever reason, we're in this place at this time in history. And if we go out into nature, we're going to be replenished by nature. Because there's a natural law and beauty in that, but also, like, how balanced am I? I can't say that I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that honesty, and I think you're right. There's a natural tension there between trying to find balance and taking care of ourselves to be able to sustain our work and feeling the fierce urgency of what we're facing. We have a question from Susie, which is, basically, do you ever feel inadequate to the tasks you've chosen, and how do you actually deal with that feeling of inadequacy? It's like group therapy here.
All the time. And I have no solution for it.
That's honest. Larry, you talked about forgiving yourself a little bit. Is there anything more you want to say?
Yeah. No, I suffer from imposter syndrome. I suffer from female inadequacy disorder all the time. But I take a look at the work that I'm doing or working towards doing, and I think, you know, maybe I will inspire the right person to do it by messing up in a way that inspires the right person to come in and do this. But someone has to be doing it right now. Someone has to put in this effort, and I'm okay with taking that on. I can be sustained by taking that on. But really, what keeps me going is the idea that maybe I'm inspiring other people to make big steps. I try and be as human as possible with people. Like, this is really hard. It's not, none of this is easy. But that doesn't mean I stop, right? You have to keep going. And especially when it's not easy, because that means that the path hasn't been made yet, which someone has to make the path. And it may not be pretty and it may not be efficient, but at least it's a start for someone else to follow. Yeah.
I think for me, around inadequacy, like having that feeling, one, I think that it's false. I think that it's something that we create ourselves. Like, it's a huge myth, because we are all adequate. We are all powerful. We so I think I challenge, like, the thinking around that, because I think that we have to be thinking about abundance. We actually have to change our whole mind frames. I think for us in the work, and especially like the community organizing work that we did that led to this work, was we never ever fronted and pretended to be anything other than who we were, ever. So what that meant is that we constantly were admitting what we didn't know. Hey, there's a bunch of stuff we don't know. Does that mean our people shouldn't have opportunity? Does that mean we shouldn't solve these problems? Does that mean, no, let's constantly admit what we don't know, and then it makes us students of the times that we are in. And then we actually put ourselves in being a position of being a learner and a lifelong learner. And I think when we're in that place, like, education's powerful. So, and there's some humility and honesty, and then you don't even have to deal with that issue, because you're constantly saying, I mean, honestly, we didn't know anything about community development or loans, or we didn't even know what we didn't even know the National Drought Mitigation Center existed until we Googled it, you know? And so I think that like in the end, it's about building power, and part of building power is building a mindset of abundance. And part of that is just admitting what we don't know, and allowing ourselves the creators of the time that we're in.
Vulnerability. So vulnerability can take the form of being honest about the fact that we don't have the answers necessarily. We have a couple of questions here that I'm just going to kind of group together because I feel like they're thematically similar. I mean, one was really around sort of the gap between our stated goals and what we're actually getting done, you know, and how do we deal with that? I mean, you'd mentioned, Sarah, Reno's plan, and this person just asked the question using that example, is there, how much of Reno's great plan is actually being done, right? And then there's another question which also gets to sort of the, some of the gaps maybe between what we see as what's necessary and what we're actually doing. And that has to do with recognizing, you know, how many people recognize that we need to consume a lot less, you know, and change our behavior versus, you know, hoping for a policy or technological fix. So you could take on either of those or both of them, but just really getting to that question of like, what's behind that gap in people's recognition of the problem and what they're actually doing.
So I work in plans a lot in the work that I do in policy. And a good plan is like a story. It's a narrative of actionable items that are designed to meet a goal that also have steps for accountability to ensure that it's doing what it's supposed to do. And I think that that's the goal behind this Reno's adaptation plan. They're also taking on, and I try and do this as well, trying to use these words in normal life, right? When we talk about building standards, changing building standards for efficiencies, making that the norm so everybody can talk about that when they're talking about development and building. But I think that keeping track of those action items and ensuring that when a plan is implemented in your area, that plan has actionable items. And if it doesn't, call them out and say, well, this is great. This is an awesome goal, but I don't see anything in here that you can do. Like, how do we break this down into steps that we can take? Where do we need to put focus? Where do we need to maybe shift the way that our current structure is to be able to handle these things? And those are frustrating conversations for people, right? Change is hard, but we have to have those conversations around these very directed goals and objectives.
Tim, Nick, any thoughts about sort of either the gap between what we're like plans, you know, you look at Paris, for example, and what people are actually doing around those commitments, or just in terms of recognizing that things are urgent, but not making the personal changes that are required.
Well, one thing I'd say around plans that's really helpful is I think that we do need benchmarks, and plans are great at creating those benchmarks. So on Pine Ridge, we never had a sustainable development plan for our region ever here. And so we organized our community and created a first ever regional sustainable development plan for the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. It include climate adaptation and mitigation, but also, you know, saving things like the Lakota language, the revitalization of our local language, the rebuilding of our economies, the rebuilding of our local infrastructure. And the nice thing about those plans were it actually created a way for us to put our ideology that everything is connected into practice. And so, you know, although you focused on, let's say, sustainable housing, or you just focused on sustainable infrastructure, that you could see its ripple effect to other things and see the true impact of what you're doing. And I think especially for like tribes, localities, municipalities, and governments, I think that it's really important to have those plans in place. And but also, like, they have to be living, breathing plans, right? They can't be like on the shelf, on the shelf plans. And I think that you have to align them with international goals of sustainability. Otherwise, they become too localized, where they're not connected to accomplishing like global goals, I guess.
Mhm. Um, somebody asked a question about, Tim, you mentioned something about how women your mother's age really responded to your story. And they just flagged that that is an interesting demographic. So any thoughts about that? Like, or, we can broaden it and say, what demographics, what parts of the population are you particularly inspired by or feel like need to be engaged more in this work?
So I mentioned that, in part because if I had been setting out to say like, what is the demographic of people that I really want to work with, or like, what is the demographic that I think, really needs to be moved or whatever, I wouldn't have said like, oh, it's definitely 60-year-old women for either of those. But the fact is, like, when I put myself out there in an authentic way, that's who resonated with it. That's who was moved by the fact that I was actually in over my head, and in a dangerous situation. And so I don't find it particularly useful to like start with the audience, to start with like who it is that we're trying to change, or who we're trying to reach, because I think most people can tell when someone is trying to manipulate them, like when they're being treated like an audience, and they can tell when someone's really being authentic, and we might not know who that is, that is really going to resonate with our authentic story when we're telling our own personal truth. Which is why I think it's important to put it out there, and be willing to engage and connect with whoever really resonates with that, and not be tied to trying to reach or change a certain group of people. But also, I think why we need a diversity of voices out there, because I don't think there's anyone who everyone is going to resonate with them. So that's why I think we need as many people as possible who are empowered to lift up their own story and speak their own personal truth, and act authentically in a public way.
Okay, here's a question from Vicky. The question is, if you had a magic wand to make something happen that is now just too slow, there's too much resistance to it, what would be your magic wand intervention? And maybe Vicky's offering to wave that magic wand for us.
I think I would probably wave away magical thinking, and wave away people's desire for easy solutions, and just have everyone sit with the messiness of this and acknowledge that like it's going to keep being messy, and that like we're not going to like suddenly win the struggle for climate justice and have a utopia here. Like we're gonna have to keep struggling, and experimenting, and
I guess go ahead, Sarah. I guess for me, part of it, I don't like magic wand questions, but if I was going to answer it, I think that like Indigenous communities and people, it's kind of been interesting to watch science catch up to what Indigenous people have been saying for such a long time. And I don't mean that in a mystical way, but I mean that in like a really practical way. where Indigenous people have been talking about these types of things for a really long time, but because science couldn't prove it in the, you know, Western science way, then it wasn't valid enough. And I think that, like, there's an interesting cross intersection that, like, it just happens to be that, you know, 80% of the world's biodiversity that's left on the planet is left in the hands and controls of Indigenous communities and people around the world. And I don't think that's an accident. And I think that there's, you know, if I was going to ask to wave a magic wand, was like, you know, like, I really do think that Indigenous communities and people and the wisdom that exists in those places is vital for the movement to climate justice around the globe. And I think that the more that Indigenous people are just treated like a natural resource, are just treated as something that is disposable, that I think that humanity is going to continue to struggle. And so, you know, I think that, you know, trying to make sure that Indigenous communities are actually resourced the right ways to be really stakeholders in this movement, in this treated as partners and not as these mystical, you know, Indigenous people that have this knowledge, but actually, like, can sign up to be warriors, arm in arm with people to help solve these problems, which means that we have to be resourced to do that work too.
It's actually really interesting that you bring that up. I'm working on an amendment to a bill that I'm running that creates a state consultation process for tribal governments, so that we can leverage those relationships in a different way. My magic wand wish is that we take care of our people so that we're not having conversations about what's more important, food on the table or the climate we live in and the world we live in, right? That drives me crazy that we don't pay people a living wage. So they're in disparities, in such disparity, they can't even consider whether they could afford to buy sustainable plates, right? Like, that is the worst place to be. We can't have these conversations because people's lives aren't in a place where they can adopt those ideas, or those without creating their own social cost and living costs. So my magic wand is pay people a living wage, give them a reasonable hour job so they can be home with their families, make sure we have roofs over everybody's heads, and then we can start, like, really rallying around these bigger issues that seem so far off from our daily lives.
That's a great segue to another question we have, which is about the Green New Deal. So what are your thoughts about the Green New Deal as a potential mechanism to move the center?
I like the idea of it as a plan, right? Give people a blueprint to start moving towards these goals, and understand that there is a system, like a systemic change that needs to happen so that we can all be on the same page, right? I really appreciate that part of it. Creating function around that, though, is the pressure of Tim's activist group. It's the pressure of Nick's community choosing to change. Those are the things that create actionable items that are what would be substantive from the new Green Deal.
Yeah, and I would say I like the Green New Deal as a strategy to shift the political discourse, you know, which I think is mostly what I've heard from Sunrise. You know, the idea of, like, getting past just the usual political discourse around climate change, where, like, one group says it's real, one group says it's not, which is, like, completely a useless discourse. And so I think the intention there was to, like, set a bar of what some serious action on climate change would look like, and in particular to set that bar for the Democratic presidential primary. And so I think we're already seeing that a little bit of it really leading to some more substantive discussion in political circles about the climate crisis. And I think that's exciting to see. And it's certainly a positive development. Yeah, I share Sarah's concerns about like actually putting into action. I mean, I think this relates back to that earlier question about the difference between our plans and ambitions and reality. You know, I mean, I don't think our current political system as a system is able to ever offer something close to the proposal of the Green New Deal. You know, I think it requires revolutionary change. You know, and I think also related to that earlier question, there is nothing, the Green New Deal is sort of a promise that like we can have everything we want. And I think it does avoid the reality that that we are going to have to cut back in significant ways. You know, particularly the more affluent parts of society, you know, are going to have to change their consumption habits. You know, we are not going to be able to continue economic growth as it's currently understood, and seriously address the climate crisis. You know, and so, you know, I think there's a risk where the Green New Deal can kind of overpromise in such a way that it avoids some of those hard truths that we need to be more open about.
And I think overall, like, to just add on to that, like it's one of those agendas, right? Like the Green New Deal can definitely be something that was inspired out of Sunrise and the Justice Democrats and New Consensus and these groups that are about 2 years old. But the reality is, like, it has to get way beyond that, and there is a whole, like, it has to be infused as an agenda in a broader movement. Otherwise, it will be this very narrow political, you know, goal that really won't be accomplished in practice. And I think that, like, you know, I mean, like a Green New Deal for the country is not going to be crafted like out of the boroughs of New York, right? A Green New Deal of this country is going to be crafted out of the places like Utah and Nevada and Pine Ridge and these other places that have hard lived experience in doing some of the work. And, you know, I keep coming back to, like, anyway, the when the Green New Deal language started coming out, like, I personally took it kind of threatening in a way as a Native person, because the original New Deal was really, the agenda was set to exploit Native people and to exploit, you know, to exploit Native people and to utilize public lands in a way that, you know, violates Indigenous people's rights. And so, you know, Indigenous people are going to have a really unique role to play in the Green New Deal, because there's, you know, 573 federally recognized tribes, 12 state recognized tribes, you know, 55.7 million acres in federal Indian trust land. These things are fundamental for, like, a overall climate justice movement for the whole country. And so I think that there's a lot of potential there if we all decide to hop on this train and make sure that this is a narrative that all of us can actually see ourselves in. But I think it's only going to be successful if it's outside of the realm of just politics too. Like, it has to be an agenda that is broader than just the political agenda, and broader than building platforms for candidates, but actually building, like, infusing a strategy into the federal government and into ways that actually have real impact beyond candidates.
Thanks. That actually gets to the last question I'm gonna ask from the audience, and that is, and from an anonymous attendee, the discussion of Indigenous communities is very interesting to me. On the one hand, we're often given visions of a future of even bigger so-called smart cities that are supposed to be more resilient and efficient. On the other hand, cities are disconnected from the land and suck resources from places indigenous people live in and are trying to protect. Is the future just more of these big cities, or more like the indigenous village? The village is not being exploited for their resources. Any thoughts on that, guys? Vision of the future. What vision do you have for the future?
I mean, I remember when Brookings Institute came out with this data about basically saying future of sustainability of America and the planet is in these cities, and in the cities where the majority of the Americans live, and without really going into depth about the roles in which rural places play for these cities to exist. And so I don't think that I think the frame shouldn't be like an either or conversation, but what ends up being the symbiotic relationship between rural America and the inner cities, and between indigenous communities and these other places, because the history definitely has been exploitive, but it doesn't have to be moving forward. And I think that for us to really think about what shared decision making looks like, and when we think of the impact of decisions made, that we take into consideration like the full effect. And so I mean, when I envision I guess a world in which there's prosperous cities, that I don't believe in prosperous cities that don't include a vision of prosperous rural places and prosperous indigenous communities as fundamental parts of even measuring prosperity altogether.
Tim, Sarah, either of you?
You know, but between those two sort of dichotomies presented in that question, you know, I certainly have a stronger personal connection to the vision that looks more like communities living in relationship to the land. You know, that looks more like indigenous villages. But I also recognize that we have well over 7 billion people on the planet at this point. And so for any of those rural communities to survive, our cities do have to drastically change, and change the way they're consuming, and develop some kind of stronger connection to where all their stuff comes from, so that they don't take it for granted as much. You know, so we do need, I think we need smarter cities, but that doesn't necessarily mean like fancier technology that makes them smart. I mean, like we need literally smarter cities with people that like aren't living sort of an abstract existence that like thinks all of their material consumption just kind of like comes from nowhere, because that puts us in a dangerous position. I mean, I was out in Davis, California a while ago, and everybody was bragging about like, you know, how self-reliant their community was, and like how they made so much progress towards resilience. And I was like, yeah, but what about Sacramento down the road and San Francisco down the road from that? Like, when the food trucks stop running to those cities, like they might not know where their food comes from in any serious kind of way, but they know it's somewhere out here where all the green stuff is. And like, what are you going to do when a couple million people show up at your door in your little rural community? So we definitely need changes in both places, and a deeper connection between the two of them, and a deeper level of understanding.
So I think about this a lot. I grew up split between living in Reno, which is a relatively urban area, and a rural county, in a off-grid house in the middle of the desert that was had water access from a water tank, right? And one of the So I think that one of the conversations we have to continue to have as we talk about what does our future look like is connectivity, so that we can disseminate information and continue education efforts so that people can be on the same page about goals. But we also have to understand that the technology that works for a population of 100,000 people is not the same technology that works for a population of 10. And when we're talking about broad project scopes, right? How do we sustain water in Nevada? That's a big question right now, right? We can't say, well, the answer is Band-Aid solution, right? We have to say, overall, what are the issues that our state is needing to address? Where are our gaps, right? Why are we in a place where we're worried about water sustainability? Is it because our aquifers aren't filling? Is it because our surface water is being over appropriated? Is it because we have leaky faucets, right, or toilets? Where are the problems, and then what's appropriate to fix those problems in those different areas? And these one-off solutions, they're really great political narratives. They don't work, right? We have to keep having complex conversations that have a lot of different people involved, who have a lot of different experience, and respect that everybody's experience is valid and has a piece to the puzzle of how we deal with our future and climate and sustainability. It all just works together, but we have to be having really complex conversations.
So we're just about at time. I want to thank you guys and give each of you just a minute if you have any closing thoughts, any sage soundbite advice for folks, and please let them know if you're involved with an organization where they can find more information about that organization. And I'd like to encourage folks to support the work of the three of you and the organizations that you work with. So please let folks know how they can get more of that information. I'm going to go in reverse order. So Tim, we're going to start with you.
All right. I mean, to me, a big takeaway from this conversation is that there's a huge range of work that needs to be done, and a huge range of ways to engage with that. But one of the common threads woven throughout that is the need for nuance and complexity in any of the ways that we're engaging, and to keep thinking openly and to keep weighing new information and keep looking for new opportunities. And you know, one of the central pieces for me in any kinds of the work that we do is, you know, we're always going to run into obstacles and organized opposition, you know, from an industry that has killed people for profit throughout its whole history. And so we need courage with whatever way we engage. We have to have that courage to keep pushing. You know, like Edward Abbey said, without courage, all other virtues are worthless. So I think any way that we courageously and thoughtfully engage in this work, there's a lot of positive things to get done. And I work primarily with the Climate Disobedience Center. You can find them at climatedisobedience.org. And we would always love some support and for people to get involved directly with us. We've been building lots of small groups that we call praxis groups, primarily in the Northeast, but now around the country. And so we'd love to have folks get involved.
Great, thanks. Sarah, let's go to you.
Thanks. I have meetings pending out my door. So I am in a singular state out of 51 in the country, but there are some cohesive ways to find out what's being done, what's effective in other states that you can bring to your local legislators. I think it's called the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. Pulled it up. earlier, it's NCEL.net, that has a ton of resources on what's being done in your area, or what has been done in your area, what you can support and what you can push your legislators to try and adopt, and gives additional resources on where those came from. Being a legislator, the most effective lobbying is from my constituents, the people who care in my community, who are impacted the most every day. And what I try and glean from what they come to me with is, what is the quality of life issue we're trying to solve, right? So framing your story around that, I would really encourage you to try and get in touch with the people who make decisions in your region and let them know that you care about these areas. Because when you let them know you care, you let them know that where your vote will land. And that means a lot, unfortunately. I don't work with many other entities outside of Nevada, so that's my one pitch. But good luck, everybody. Stay strong. Do this. Stick together.
Thanks. Nick?
So I work with the NDN Collective, and so I encourage folks to go to ndncollective.org. We also have a podcast called Wild Indigenous, that is basically like Wild Indigenous. This is the stuff that goes down. Check it out. We also have a big presence on social media that we've been building over time, on both Facebook and Twitter. So follow NDN Collective on Twitter and Facebook, because we're putting out lots of stuff every day, and support our work and find out more about our work at those places, and pay attention to a lawsuit that we just filed the other day. We filed a lawsuit in partnership with the ACLU, Sierra Club, and the Indigenous Environmental Network against the state of South Dakota for anti-protest legislation they just passed. So got to keep those guys honest, down on their toes, and so keep an eye out for that as it continues to happen. So you can follow us. We're easy to find.
All right, thank you. We just lost Sarah. I know she had to go to another meeting. She's in the middle of her legislative calendar right now. So Tim, Nick, I really appreciate it. It's been definitely informative and inspiring for me. I hope it's been the same for our audience. And good luck with your work. And if there's anything that we at Post Carbon Institute can do to support it, we're all ears. We're right there for you. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Yep.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.